and entrepreneurship at the Chicago Biomedical Consortium, where she advises academic researchers on drug discovery and leads the Entrepreneurial Fellows Training Program. You'll hear a little bit more about that today. Prior to joining CBC, Liz worked at Novartis as Director of Global Search and Evaluation, building the ideal pipeline for clinical stage gene therapies. And most recently in the modality agnostic severe genetic disease space as well. So she has deep experience in life strategy consulting, where she developed actionable investments, development, and commercial recommendations for pharma, biotech, med device, and investor clients. So a whole wide range of different types of skill sets and avenues that PhDs can find themselves in. And Liz holds a PhD in genetics from University of Wisconsin and a bachelor's in biological sciences from Northwestern University. She's a former collegiate sailor and recreational endurance athlete, which I would love to hear more about that if you have some time. But today she's now spending her free time chasing her 2 kids and relaxing with a good book. And I'll ask at the end, what is your favorite book to share when we wrap up? But I'm so excited to hand it over to Liz. Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thank you for having me. And I'm really excited to talk to everyone today. I'm fairly new to the Chicago Biomedical Consortium in this role. I just started in August. But as Joanne said, I've worn different hats in the time since I left the bench in 2014. And so I'm happy to talk to you about my career path and, some of the decisions that I made to get me where I am. So I'll start by telling you basically, how did I get here? And from the career perspective, I'll walk you through the different steps. The slides aren't that pretty. Unfortunately, I had gorgeous slides when I was at Novartis, but when you leave big pharma, you can't take a thing. And so I'll just kind of be talking through some of this, but I really want it to be question and answer aspects. So wherever we get to, but I want to answer your questions. So don't hold them to the end. So I'll talk about my career, and then I'll tell you a little bit about what we're doing here with the Chicago Biomedical Consortium and an opportunity we have. I'll try to keep this pretty brief because it may or may not be relevant to you guys, but I also think there are likely other opportunities even beyond Chicago that are doing something like this. And if it sounds interesting to you, I would encourage you to seek them out. If you're interested in coming to Chicago, you should certainly apply to our program, and I'll tell you about that. And then segueing from that, we have like a framework that the fellows use when they are thinking through academic research projects to determine how attractive they could be to venture investment and to become biotech companies. And so if we have time, I have some examples. I can talk you through it. The slides are super dense, but again, we can make it a question and answer, and then come back to any unanswered questions at the end. So I will talk you through my career journey, and it's a mix of personal and professional, like as anyone's life is. So I started at Northwestern as an undergraduate, having had worked in high school as a certified nurse's assistant caring for Alzheimer's patients. So I kind of had a bit of a clinical perspective. I spent some of my summers doing that, working second shift. And then I sailed. I had my sailing training in the morning during summers, and then I would go work second shift as a nurse's assistant at an Alzheimer's center. But so I had that clinical perspective, but then also my last summer before going to college, I had the opportunity to work in a research lab. And so I came in with both those perspectives, but I really thought I was going to go the physician route, as I think many people go to school thinking, get a degree in biology, go be a doctor. But in the middle of undergraduate, I had been conducting research, doing all of that. I got invited to go to an MD, PhD forum. I mean, I guess I should maybe this is too basic. The thing that made me realize I didn't just want to be a doctor was I loved how all of my different classes, I could see how one piece of knowledge I was learning in one class connected with something that I was learning in a different class. And I was really curious about how new knowledge came into being. So that made me go into research. And so then I had the question of MD, PhD, or PhD. I went to an MD, PhD conference at Baylor, and basically everyone there told me, if you really want to be a scientist and learn the scientific process, don't go the MD, PhD route. And so then I decided, okay, I want to be a scientist. I want to be a professor. I went and did my PhD at Wisconsin in genetics. And this decision about where to go to grad school was already somewhat influenced by a personal decision or personal life. So I met a guy at Northwestern, really great. Had to make the decision, do I leave the Midwest where I could be in driving distance to this person who I think I might marry, or do I go to the coasts? And luckily, Wisconsin seemed like a good enough fit. I'm originally from Wisconsin. They had a really strong genetics program. There were some labs that I was excited to work in. So I went to Wisconsin, which allowed me to maintain that relationship because my boyfriend at the time was in Chicago, and I don't know, there's your professional career and then there's your personal life. And so I had made that decision where to go. Luckily, it was great. So the research you're seeing there, I was a developmental biologist at Northwestern. I got really excited about stem cell biology, developmental biology questions. So I went to Wisconsin and studied developmental genetics, lung development and disease. But about halfway through my PhD, I again had to make a decision. I wanted to be a faculty. I had the NSF, GRFP, was publishing papers, things were looking good, but the path to being a professor, you have to go do a postdoc at a very particular lab in a very particular city, and then you go on the job market and you have to go to whatever city you get a job in. And that was difficult for balancing a 2-career family, which I still wasn't engaged at this time, but I felt like I had to make this decision. And so I chose the guy again and said, what other careers could I leverage the skills that you learn in academia to get a job in a very particular location, which was moving back to Chicago. And so from my experience in undergraduate at Northwestern, I knew about consulting, and a lot of my friends on the sailing team and other things had gone into consulting. So I knew it was an area that I could leverage my project planning, data analyses, communication skills, team management, everything I learned in graduate school to move to consulting. So I'll tell you about consulting in a second. That's sort of my academic journey. But the theme you'll see across these slides is I really do believe that your career is a learning journey. And for me, at least, I'm not trying to get to any particular place. Decided long ago, I don't want to be CEO necessarily, unless that's like the last thing left for me to do where I can learn things. But at each job I've taken, it's been, how can I leverage what skills I have to learn new things? So in graduate school, some of the skills that when I think about, and that's what I listed here, it's like you have deep content knowledge, you learn data analyses, you learn problem solving and communication and project management. So I took those skills and then I went to consulting, where I was able to learn a number of different things. So I got a job at a small boutique consulting firm in Chicago. They were exclusively focused on pharma, biotech, life science, med device. So unlike going to some of these larger strategy consulting firms where in your first couple of years, you would be working on, automotive industry or retail strategy or all of these non-science questions, I was able to really learn the business of pharma, biotech. And so I didn't have much business experience, beyond like auditing some classes when I was at Wisconsin. So consulting was really a crash course in business, but it was also, I learned strategic thinking. I learned client management, and you kind of have that a bit in grad school. Your PI is kind of your client. And if you're successful, you can learn to manage up with your PI. Basically, you tell them what you're going to do before they tell you what to do. And then they start to realize that, they don't have to micromanage you if they're that type of person. There's lots of personalities, but I really learned about client management and the empathy you have to build to be able to sell projects. I learned about market research, forecasting, and then I would say I expanded on some of my people management skills. So I found a PowerPoint presentation, which we call decks, which I didn't learn until I went to consulting. Maybe you guys already call them decks, but PowerPoint presentations are called decks in the business world. So I had given a career talk back in 2016. And so I pulled these slides from it. But if you really want to know more about consulting, I can send you that whole deck. But some of the types of questions that I was helping answer when I was in consulting is, should a client invest in developing or acquiring a product? So those were opportunity evaluations, commercial evaluations, and forecasting. So we would have, and the clients we would have who wanted this type of thing would be in business development in pharma or biotech. They might be investors like private equity or fund managers. And so they would want to know how much demand is there going to be for this product. So we would be talking to a lot of physicians and key opinion leaders to understand how the field was going to evolve. We'd talk to insurance companies to understand how they would think about paying for these products. We'd look at competition, other products in the pipeline, a variety of different factors, including patient preference, to get to how much is this product worth? Because that's what decision making comes down to the money. We would also do development strategy, thinking about like what endpoints should the client use to develop the product, or can we take this mechanism of action and develop it for other diseases? We would also work on marketing strategy and launch preparation. So thinking about how you could advertise or message a drug based on what the needs were in the market. So we go and conduct market research to find out what patients wanted, what resonated with doctors, and then we'd come up with a plan. So variety of different questions there. And so I was in, we'll stop there for a second, and then I'll tell you about like my transition from consulting to business development. But are there any questions sort of on the moving from academia into consulting or anything about consulting? Paige.
Yeah, so this is something that I'm really interested in doing beyond my PhD, and looking more into business development as well as like evaluation and acquisition.
Mm-hmm.
So one thing that I've always been curious about is if you were to audit those business classes or go back in time and audit different business classes, what do you think gives you the most competitive advantage coming from a research position? Because I think my concern is that, like, yes, you learn a lot of things on the job, but if you don't have like the terminology and the skill set that they're looking for when you're applying for these positions, how do you leverage yourself and say like, well, no, this is really interesting and I promise you that I can learn them,
So I think it's important to understand the different factors that can make a product successful. So one of the things I learned when I took it was an entrepreneurial boot camp that Wisconsin did one summer. And I went into it thinking, you make a really cool product, of course, people are going to buy it. That's not true. There needs to be a market need for something, and the product has to fit the market need. Now, there are situations where, like through marketing, you can create the market need, but there has to be a need, like people want it, or in biotech or pharma, there has to be a problem that you're solving. And so that product market fit is really important. But then ultimately what's going to impact investment. So, and we'll get to this in a few slides in the next section, but think about what that need is and what the product would have to do to address it. Think about competition, think about pricing. It's ultimately, what's it going to take to sell this, and being able to think about the different factors that could impact how much money it could make. However you need to learn that, I think that is the most important skill set. Finance is always an area that I think PhDs feel challenged by, perhaps like imposter syndrome. There is a Coursera course that's for free. It's called Finance for Non-Finance Professionals. It's done by a professor out of Rice University. It's pretty good, starting with the basics and then getting into more complex things, but they will get into there how you make a business decision for like a return on your investment, or some of those metrics are what we would use in business development. Yes, that class. So it's free. You can check it out. I do think finance is one area that I think PhDs, myself included, like always felt like we didn't know as much. And the business folk always had a leg up on us. Throughout my career, I've realized when you do learn by doing things, and when you learn by doing and trial and error, you know things a lot better than if it's just somebody telling you this is how we do it. So even though it's very painful sometimes to go through, your depth and understanding of the material is much better. And so that was the case for me in consulting. It was a very small firm. There were like 20 people there, and they just threw me in the deep end. It's like, this is the problem the client needs to solve. Here's a few examples for how we've done this in the past. Go figure it out. And even though it's really hard and there's a steep learning curve, I think that experience was very valuable for like setting me up for the rest of my career. So.
Gotcha. That was very helpful. Thank you.
Awesome. Happy to help. So I went into consulting. I was there for about 5.5 years. And so I started as an analyst, or a senior analyst, which is basically the bottom of the totem pole. And by the time I left, I was starting to sell projects. I was a managing consultant. I moved through the ranks of consultant, senior consultant, managing consultant. But at the really small firm, I was able to take on enough responsibilities. Whatever I showed them that I was capable of, I would take on responsibilities. So it wasn't very strict titles. It's just wherever people need help, if you're willing to help, you will be able to assume more responsibilities. And so it was a really good experience, but it was a small firm. It was owned by a single owner, and I was starting to bump up against what felt like some sort of ceiling, where I didn't know how I was going to be able to convert going from kind of a doer or a manager to a seller and an owner in the business, which is always that next step. And it was around the time that I had my first child. It was toward the end of consulting, and it was just time for a move. When you're in consulting, the client kind of always comes first. And so I forgot to tell you the story. Moved to Chicago, got married, all this stuff. Anyway, best decision of my life. Like, I don't know, they say who you marry is like the most important decision. Anyway, so really great guy, made the right decision. We were both in consulting. Clients came first. We were really pushing the grindstone, make the money, climb the ladder, et cetera. But then, we got to a point where we're like, okay, time to start having kids. So we had our first child, and within 9 months after my son was born, both my husband and I left consulting, because we no longer wanted the client to come first. We wanted to be able to prioritize our family. And luckily, there was an opportunity for me to move in the Chicago area to Avexis. So Chicago doesn't have a lot of biotech, and I didn't want to move to the coasts. And so I was always looking for, what's that move or exit from consulting going to be. Luckily, I was in the right place at the right time with the right skill set that I was able to jump to Avexis. It was after the Novartis had bought them, but they were still a standalone entity. And I interviewed for a corporate strategy role, but while I was interviewing, they said, well, we might have a need in business development. Where are your interests? And for me, one of the reasons to move to corporate was to understand how a business works. So when you're in consulting, you only have clients in a very particular group within the company. And so you don't understand the full picture of how an organization works. And when you're in business development, you interface with manufacturing, with regulatory, with quality, with finance, with all of the different pieces. And so they gave me the opportunity. Do you want to be in corporate strategy working on like strategic projects, or do you want to be in business development? And I raised my hand. I said business development. So it was cool that I was able to kind of create my own role. It wasn't the one that I applied for. And so that's also a lesson as you're going through, maybe not your first job, but some of my fellows I'm encouraging to imagine what their ideal role would be and then work with the startups to create it. So I went to Avexis. They were owned by Novartis. They were a gene therapy company. So they developed Zolgensma, which was the first systemic gene therapy. It's for spinal muscular atrophy. So type 1 SMA babies would die before the age of 2 if they weren't treated. And so there was a drug that launched called Spinraza that came from Biogen, I think a year or two before Zolgensma launched. And so prior to Spinraza, SMA babies was an absolute death sentence. Then Spinraza came to the market, but it was something that they were having to get intrathecally, so into their spinal column at very frequent intervals. So it was challenging. I don't think the data were very good. And then Avexis was able to find a one-time AAV-based gene therapy to, at the time, we hoped to cure spinal muscular atrophy. Since that point in time, the data have come back and it's not curative for everyone. And there are some challenges, but it really held this big promise. So I was so excited to join a gene therapy company. When I was there, it was my job to build the deal pipeline. Essentially, I had to know the whole landscape of the gene therapy, all the different companies, all the different assets. Luckily, we primarily focused in the clinical stage. I primarily focused on clinical stage assets. And so I had to know what they all were. I had to know what we as a company thought about it and whether we wanted to buy it or not. And I ran through all of these business cases, evaluations, and ultimately came to the conclusion that there was nothing we wanted to buy. And it took a long time to convince leadership, but we had all of these very well-developed deal cases and reasons why we weren't going to do a deal. And we were just going to watch and wait to see how things resolved. And over the time that I was there, the gene therapy field just really imploded. But because we were within Avexis, we knew what was happening internal to our programs. And so we were able to take that internal knowledge and apply it to how we were thinking externally. And that prevented us from doing a lot of potentially bad deals that a number of other companies did. And not bad for patients, but bad in terms of finances. Like when you pay too much for an asset, then you're going to be able to get back. Anyway, so Avexis turned into Novartis Gene Therapies, which was then my role was fully transferred over into Novartis Corporate. So it was an interesting experience. I was there for about 3 years and I got to see how the small biotech operated because Avexis was independent. Novartis was trying to keep it independent until problems happened. Too many problems happened and then they like reeled us in. And so then I got to see the small biotech and dealing with all the crises and everything. And then I got to see big corporate life because my role got transferred into Novartis Corporate. And there's pros and cons to both. What I really liked about being at Novartis, like big pharma, honestly, the people were so nice, thoughtful, smart. Like what I found is when you're in a small company, there's not as many pressures to like be nice to people and work together. But when you're in a larger company, you know, in order to get stuff done, you have to cooperate. And so people really, it was just a pleasure to work with them. And it has really helped me to have had that experience and all of that empathy training and communication training that we got at Novartis when I came to the CBC, because I forgot, like, academia is not like that. People do not necessarily play nice. They are not respectful of each other. They are not working towards solving a common goal. And anyway, so when I was at Avexis and Novartis, I was learning much more about clinical stage assets. When I was in consulting, I learned a lot about the commercial and the business. I ultimately left Novartis because I'd spent 3 years not doing deals. And it really didn't look like Novartis wanted to do deals in the rare disease space. So I didn't think that I was going to spend multiple years not doing deals, and that wasn't okay for me. I was kind of demotivated because you'd spend a lot of work doing these deal evaluations. Ultimately, it didn't matter. I mean, you would help leadership make a well-informed decision, but it just wasn't fulfilling to me. And so I had the opportunity to come to the CBC to work on early drug development, of which I didn't know much about. So I was in basic science when I was at Northwestern, Wisconsin, went all the way over to commercial for consulting, moved a bit backwards into clinical stage asset development. And now I'm going to academia, where I'm going to work on early drug discovery. And so I wanted to learn about that. I also was seeing that there wasn't much innovation in the clinical stage side. And so where was that next wave of innovation going to come? It was going to come from academia. So I wanted to do that. At the CBC, we're also learning about, we work with venture investors. So I wanted to learn about venture capital, how you build these businesses, and I really wanted to mentor. So I was really excited when the opportunity came up to come to the CBC to help reinvent it. And I'll tell you more about CBC in a second. Questions? Okay. I will say that
Hi.
Oh, go ahead.
So sorry. I just had a quick question. Considered after graduating your PhD going into more like corporate pharma industry positions, but like at the research level. So like still continuing, the bench science, but in industry versus academia.
So I was in developmental biology, developmental genetics.
Right.
Honestly, the types of work of experiments and work I was doing was not directly applicable to what industry was looking at. And there wasn't, so I was trying to get to Chicago where there wasn't much. There was like AbbVie, Big Pharma, and a few others, but there just weren't jobs that were a match for my skill set. So I felt like I would have had to go do a postdoc to get, more cell culture, or I don't even remember what the techniques were back then that people wanted, but I didn't feel like that was actually an option for me.
Got it. Okay, thanks.
I will also say that I was thinking about how much bang can I get for my buck, or how much buck can I get for my bang is probably a better way. So I knew that I wanted to have kids someday. Like, that was important to me. And I knew that childcare costs a lot of money. And so I was like, I graduated when I was 27. I was like, okay, if I want to, get there, have kids someday, et cetera, how can I make as much money in a shorter period of time to be able to set myself up for that? Nobody wants to talk about money or think about it, but consulting was a way to be on a pretty fast ramp. I will say, like, I think I tripled my salary. I'm just doing the math in my head. Yeah, I like basically tripled my salary Although I took a pay cut when I left Novartis to come to the CBC, but it was basically because I had spent the time in consulting and in biotech and pharma that I was able to like put away enough money and two-career family and stuff that I was able to take a pay cut to go to my current role. But I do think finances are, when you're thinking about your career and you're thinking about what you want to do, and what you're willing to trade off in the short term, it's something to think about.
Thank you for being so honest. Helpful. Thanks.
Okay, so now that I've talked for half an hour on my career, I will try to go through some of these other slides more quickly. So I'm going to go back. Oh no, I took these slides from somebody and they have animations on it and I can't stand animations. I'm so sorry. So the Chicago Biomedical Consortium is a nonprofit that was founded in 2006, wealthy donor family who said, you have 3 great universities in Chicago, why aren't you collaborating? So they gave money for collaborative research awards. 10 years, the universities are collaborating well, but nothing's coming of it. So this is just to show that in Chicago area, in Illinois, we are getting federal funding, not as much as the Boston area, but a decent amount. But over here on the right-hand side, we don't have companies, we don't have venture, we don't have money going in or company formation. And so 10 years after they founded the CBC, the donors said, we need to change this. So how can we use our nonprofit platform to help accelerate some of the research that's happening in Chicago to keep it in Chicago? Because what was happening is the IP was getting licensed and it was getting taken to the coasts because that's where the venture capitalists wanted to build the companies. And so what we are doing is we have funding for what we call accelerator awards to help bridge the valley of death, we call it, in drug development. So you have your discovery process. You have really good biology. You are potentially developing, you have a good target, you're developing an assay, and there's NIH dollars for these early stages. But once you want to screen for small molecules or develop biologics, there isn't a lot of money for this, but venture doesn't want to invest often at this early stage unless you have some really groundbreaking science where they just want to see, I'm going to throw stuff at a wall and make it stick. Sometimes there are those investors who will take a gamble. But if you have, say, a really compelling mechanism to treat hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, but you need to do these screens, you have to find non-academic money to do it. And so venture wants to pick it up over here where you have your in vivo data showing that this could potentially be best in class, a game-changing therapy. So we have awards that we can give faculty, some early awards, directors funds to help with milestone-driven research, to help them develop assays, screen for hits. Or then when they have compelling hits, if you're doing small molecules, we can then, so directors funds are like 35 to 50,000. And then we can give them accelerator awards, which are $250,000 to help optimize their lead compound, run some of their animal models and de-risk it. We also then have a board of venture capitalists that come from the coasts. We have some local, we have some international who we present these projects to. And we ultimately will not fund projects with an accelerator award unless we have an investor who's willing to say, yes, if these experiments go well, I would invest and I would form a company. So this is the process we're developing to be able to infuse money into promising research to try to develop it here in Chicago. And then there was a third component to that. It was, we need talent in Chicago. We need to train our graduate students or attract talent, and we need to teach them entrepreneurship so that they can be some of the early sources of talent for these companies that are going to be spinning out. So I run the entrepreneurial fellowship program. What it is a one-year fellowship. You get an $85,000 stipend plus benefits. It can be extended to 2 years. Normally that second year is to try to, you might be doing an externship with a startup, or you might be trying to help a company get venture money so they can form. So we would be providing salary, and you would be kind of working on helping support that early company in that second year. The first year, you are really doing a lot of diligence and working with faculty at the universities to evaluate their ideas, help steer the research direction such that it could be a more promising translational project. So you get a salary, you're going to learn by doing. You're going to be doing a lot of analyses that it's like consulting, it's like business development, it's like venture capital, and you'll be doing that on the research projects coming out of University of Chicago, Northwestern, and University of Illinois, Chicago. We also have a lot of career development as part of this. Tons of networking in the Chicago area, networking with venture. You're going to learn drug development. You're going to learn about how could a drug be commercially successful. It's really you're going to learn about venture creation and financing. And so this is a bit about our program. I won't go into a ton more detail, but the types of work that the fellows do in that first year after they get their initial training, which is kind of an immersive hands-on course, they work with faculty. So they might go to a particular department and look through all the faculty and say, this research sounds exciting. It sounds like it could be potentially applicable to a drug. They'll set up meetings with the faculty to talk about where are they in the research. And CBC staff, myself, we are all there with the fellows to figure out where they are and where they could fall in our funding cycle. The fellows will then conduct diligence, and I'll be getting, actually the next page, I'll tell you about what some of those questions are that they are, quote, diligencing, but essentially trying to figure out how attractive this idea is and how it could be developed. We have a variety of different boards that come from industry. So we have drug developers from big pharma, drug developers from small biotech, we have academics, we have VCs, just a large network that we can get ideas in front of to get feedback. And then ultimately the fellows are building a pitch deck to pitch to venture to figure out what we can get funded. Once it has been funded, the fellows then get to project manage these projects. And we try to fund projects that use CROs, contract research organizations, to do the work. It can help validate. There are sometimes questions about work that's done in academia because so many of the results that come out of academia are difficult to repeat for whatever reason. And so we want to make the results as compelling to venture as possible. So we support work done at CROs where possible. And so the fellows get experience like working with the CROs, doing negotiations, analyzing results, which are skill sets that are very transferable if you go to biotech. Even pharma at Novartis, we would use CROs sometimes. So I'm just going to take a breath. Before I get into some of the questions and things we think about, do you guys have any questions on the program? Okay. It is just in Chicago. We want people to come who want to stay in Chicago, at least in the near term. I will say good things about Chicago. You'd get to be a big fish in a small pond in some ways. We have minimal natural disasters. We have lots of water. Relatively cheap cost of living, which is one of the reasons I stayed here. I could give you lots of pitches about Chicago, but I will say, you know, the weather is not one of them, but no forest fires, no droughts. Anyway, no earthquakes. I don't know if you have that, but yes, the river's getting dyed tomorrow, actually. So yes, we do St. Patrick's Day well. Cool. So yeah, if you're interested, I have some information about the program. We take multiple cohorts a year and everything, but let's talk now about sort of transferable skills, things that we do in our program that you can think about to your work or even moving forward in the future. So I developed these questions when I came to the CBC because we needed a way to evaluate the ideas in sort of a systematic way. And we have a very detailed framework, which I didn't really go into. You'll see in the next few slides, but under transformative potential, there might be like 5 different criteria you think about or scientific evidence, et cetera. But the 5 big things we think about when it comes to a new idea is the first one is transformative potential. So how much of an impact could this new therapy have? And that is determined by really how big is the unmet need. So is there a current treatment that works pretty well? Maybe it's burdensome to take, like you have to get injections twice a month, or there's bad side effects, or it's really a disease that you have no treatment for and people are dying prematurely. So you have to understand the unmet need. And this is kind of the product market fit that we talked about before. And then evaluate to what extent is this innovation going to change the status quo? So is this going to be an add-on therapy to what is currently available? Or is this going to replace what you currently have? And depending on the situation, ideally, we would love something that could replace the status quo. In something like cancer, you're never going to replace chemo. You're just going to be added on top of chemo. So that it's dependent on what you're talking about. So we want projects with compelling transformative potential. And ultimately, that's what venture capital wants to see too. Then we get into the scientific evidence. So based on everything the lab puts forward, how strongly do we believe in the approach? Is there good rationale for the target? Is it mutated in humans and associated with a disease? Have they done knockout mouse model? It all just depends on the project, but we're looking at rationale for target, proof of the mechanism, impact on disease is, even if you can show that you can impact the mechanism that you say you are you able to impact the disease? And one example of this is with gene therapy. In certain genetic diseases, the problem is you have essentially missing protein because you have mutations that lead to the full functional protein not able to be made. And so you replace that gene, you replace that protein. You would think that even if you can do that mechanism, you could cure the disease. But in some cases, like neurodegenerative diseases, there's a very fine window, a very small window where you can replace that gene and actually have an impact on the course of the disease. If too many neurons have died, you're not going to be able to change the course of the disease. So, that's just a consideration. And are you going to be able to get there? Essentially, evaluate the science. Then the next piece is how straightforward is development feasibility. So how difficult and expensive is this going to be to develop? So when you're thinking about preclinical, are there good preclinical models for your disease? Are there safety concerns? What are the clinical trials going to look like? Is this a disease where you're going to have to run huge clinical trials with long endpoints, or is there a good biomarker that you could look at after 4 weeks or 6 weeks? Is it all manifests in time and money? I mean, time is money, but that will determine how attractive it is for venture, for pharma, et cetera. CMC and manufacturing is also important here. So particularly like with cell and gene therapies, they have run into so many roadblocks historically, which, there's always problems. Trials are going on clinical hold all the time as the field is evolving. So development feasibility, we think about all those different questions. Then commercial opportunity. So how much money could you make if this worked? How large is the patient population? And the relevant patient population. So even though you have 10,000 people with the disease, there are many different factors that could lead some to be more severe or less severe, some to be more applicable for one treatment or less applicable. So you really have to think about who is our target population, how big is it? What does the competition look like? Either the competition that you currently have on the market or that's in the pipeline. And so we are looking at academic preclinical assets. So we have to think that a good portion of things that are in development are going to be on the market by the time we get there. So we have to have a reason for why we're going to be differentiated and be able to have an opportunity. There's also pricing considerations. So if there is a standard of care therapy, how much does it cost? In a field or in a disease where the standard of care is generic, there are some challenges. You have to be really good to be able to command the premium pricing that you're going to need to be able to make up all the development costs that we talked about in the prior one. We look at insurance reimbursement and a variety of other factors. Then near-term execution comes into play. So we look at the disease area. It's how confident are we that this team that we are looking to fund could progress this program and get the follow-on funding. So one important component of this evaluation is looking at the venture financing environment. So is this a therapeutic area that venture has historically and in recent history been investing in? And it's sad, but there are areas that venture won't touch. Hospital products, wound care, pain, microbiome. They're areas that are just not lucrative or they've gotten burned in. And so people who are trying to develop drugs in some of those areas will be very challenged. It's a shame. We will also talk to some pharma because even if you can't go the venture route, sometimes you can partner academic assets or early biotechs with pharma. So that's another way. And then we look at, how much money has the team got and some more internal aspects. Before I move, so I have a couple examples that I can talk you through so you can see how some of these criteria play out. Any questions or comments on these criteria?
Hey, Liz, I had some questions about the fellowship program. These were like questions from the last section that you kind of went over.
Okay.
One was, does the fellowship program have a fixed start date or is it kind of a flexible start date?
So we're hoping to take 2 cohorts throughout the year. So we will have, and they do kind of vary based on our needs. I mean, this is our current cohort. We're hoping to start after Labor Day in September, but we're opening applications in April and May. And you need to have your PhD in hand basically by August.
Okay.
And then there'll likely be another application cycle to begin in early 2024.
Okay, gotcha. My other question was, have you had fellows graduate from the program already and gone on to do other things? And if so, where have they gone on to after completing the program?
Yeah, so we had 2 fellows who went through a prior iteration of the entrepreneurial fellowship. I currently have 4 fellows that have just finished up their year, and I can tell you about where we're looking for them to go. But the 2 who went through the program in a slightly prior iteration, one went to Deerfield, and he does essentially drug hunting at the academic level for Deerfield, which is a big finance group. They have a venture arm. And we actually work pretty closely with him because he's one of the people who wants, we help fund projects that he would want to take up. The other person went into project management at Tempus, which is a genetic testing company in Chicago. She has since moved to the Bay Area and is doing project management for a biotech out there. But so yeah, she went the project management route. Carissa, I think is her name, and then Eric went to Deerfield. Our current 4 fellows, so as part of the program, and I didn't actually talk about it, we toward the end of that year, they start doing 1 day a week externship projects. So where they go to local companies and they're working with the companies, and it's our hope that it's a try before you buy, that the companies will like the work that they're doing and then want to hire them. And so we also, as the CBC, do a lot of these sort of strategic projects, new product planning, business direction. And so often startups don't have the capacity to do that. And they may go to a consulting company to get some of that work. We've said, don't go to a consulting company, take one of our externs. And so all 3 of our externs basically have offers to go to Series A type companies to do either a combination of bench science and business development type strategy work or new product planning strategy work. Or we have one who really, he's like a data scientist. And so he's going to do a data scientist role with, he's thinking like they have verbal offers, but they're still finishing up. One of them is, there was a project that came through the Accelerator Award that we actually didn't fund because it was in the microbiome space. And it was so sad because it's such a good team. It's a really compelling product. They have something in infectious disease that works. We had proposed, like, why don't you develop this for gout? Like, could you make a microbiome, basically a probiotic that you take and it treats gout? And there's so many patients with gout. We thought it was really good. Venture didn't like it because they hate the microbiome space. But the company was able to pivot to an environmental angle. So how can they use their microbiome for environmental remediation and get some funding that way? And then they're going to continue to work on the health component in the background. But he is trying to help that company find some more money, and then they want him to be the first employee. So they're really at this interface of like seeds, Series A, wearing many different hats. But because of some of the strategy work or strategic thinking they get from the fellowship, they're able to help at that business development level. You know, they don't just come in as scientists, which there's nothing wrong coming in as scientists, but it's our help that we can fill this gap that Chicago doesn't have. So, Paige?
Yeah, so I have a couple of questions on these like key questions. So I guess when you are reaching out to academic labs, I'm thinking of like my PI and the people in my department, and I study like cancer biology, but I feel like a lot of us don't really do a lot of translational research. We do a lot of basic science, understanding like cancer mechanisms. So my first question is, how exactly do you find labs that are working on things that could be like clinical targets and things like that? And then my follow-up question is, if they were to be funded, like who does bring those projects through? Like, is it PhDs and postdocs in a lab, or is it more so hiring people and building a team that take that intellectual property and turn it into a company? Does that make sense?
Yeah. So let me go back to this slide. So it does really vary. So sometimes labs have like research scientists who know it really well, and this is like a special project, like a postdoc or a research scientist who would want to spin out the company. And so they pivot a little bit more to thinking about those aspects when they're more, I guess, in this middle stage. But graduates, like graduate students, postdocs, like professor, there is a range of people who do this.
Gotcha.
Have you guys heard of Nucleate? Do you guys have a chapter of Nucleate at UC Irvine?
I don't believe we have a chapter here.
Okay, that's something I think it's relatively newly formed, but they take graduate students and business students and they will pair them up with labs that have some of this research. And the graduate student and MBA teams will work on kind of the business plan and helping to drive things forward. And when, so there's a postdoc crisis, and labs are finding they can't find people to do the work for a variety of reasons, and that's where the CROs come in too. So if there are aspects like building an assay, if they have really strong data for a target, you can go to some CROs and you can have some ideas about assays, but the CROs can build a particular assay, fluorescence, polarization, FRET, a variety of other things to show that like a molecule can bind to a particular place, or they can do functional assays. So assay development can be done at CROs. Hit identification, you can do virtual screens for small molecules. You can do, once you have your assay, you can do the in vitro screens. So those are things that, again, that can be done by cores or core facilities or CROs. And then when you get to the lead optimization, the SAR, the structure activity relationship work, can again be done at CROs or cores. Like all of this stuff could theoretically be outsourced. If there are the capabilities to do it in lab, then the staff there could do it. In terms of how do we find faculty, variety of different reasons. One of my fellows, he actually did one of his externships with Deerfield, and he came up with like search strings to go through NIH grant reporter for like certain keywords, because they were trying to find early career faculty. Big publications, going to talks, talking to people just to see who has exciting science. But we're looking for diseases that have a high unmet need. We're looking for targets or like scientific rationale for something that could be transformative or compelling. Those are the kind of things we're thinking about. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that answers the questions. Thank you so much.
Cool. So I can talk you through, and I know there's so much on these slides. Oops. These slides are meant to be read. So the fellows will make like a couple slides. That's an initial triage. And then we send them to experts and we get their thoughts on it. So this was a it's a nanoparticle that delivers rapamycin to antigen presenting cells at the time in diabetes when the T cell cascade is really building. And so it's a therapy to prevent or halt the progression of type 1 diabetes. And so recently, stage 3 type 1 diabetes is when it would typically get diagnosed, because there's a significant loss of beta cells. These patients are presenting with outward symptoms of like their loss of glycemic control, but you can detect it earlier if you're looking for the right things. And so because we now understand more about this biology, they are able to, there's actually a therapy that was just approved called Tzield, teplizumab, that is being used for stage 2 diabetes patients to lead to T cell anergy to slow the process of the loss of beta cells. So this is the technology that the faculty came to us with, and we looked into it. And I guess I'll flip to the next slide. This is how we evaluated it and triaged it. So we felt that there was, if it could do what they say it could do, there was transformative potential there. So the current standard of care, Tzield, left things to be desired. So it could delay the onset of type 1 diabetes by 2 years, but it was that's 2 years. Can we delay it by 4 years, for example? And these patients were also struggling with lymphopenia, leukopenia, anemia, some of these other side effects. So the hope is, could this product avoid some of that? They had some pretty good animal data, so they could prevent type 1 diabetes onset in 5 of 6 mice. They were also doing islet cell transplantation. They had some pretty good data. So we gave it like positive ratings for that. In terms of the development feasibility, because it's a nanoparticle, we had some questions on what would be the regulatory path. And as we've dug into this more, we have found out that it's actually like considered an excipient with a 505(b)(2) product. So 505(b)(2), it's not like a new drug application because they're using rapamycin, which is an old drug. And so it's not going to be as compelling there. In terms of the commercial opportunity, we think it's challenging to be able to find these patients. So they're typically clinically presenting at stage 3. You need to implement more widespread screening for like blood sugar at pediatric visits to be able to, or like your kids' annual visits. Maybe you could screen for antibodies, or maybe you could screen for blood sugar levels, but they're not currently doing that. So we saw that as a hurdle. In terms of, and there's significant competition, which we're digging more into. In terms of near-term execution, this lab has developed other companies, and the VC market, there is money there for investment. So this is a project that we took through our initial triage, and now we're digging into deeper diligence in preparation for pitching it for an accelerator award. We don't know if they're going to get it. Like, there are some challenges with the rapamycin and with the space, so we'll have to see. But this one came out pretty positive. Questions or comments? I'll run you through one more just so you can see. I'm also going to take a quick look at the comments. Okay. Just another example. We had a professor who came to us with a soluble ACE2. So it's an endogenous protein that he created that has greater bioavailability in a variety of different aspects that would allow it to improve blood pressure lowering, basically. He had a tool, but he didn't really have a disease. And so he ended up deciding to go into scleroderma renal crisis. But essentially I'll come to that. There's this renin-angiotensin system that you have kind of in your kidneys that controls vasoconstriction, vasodilation. And this is the target for many different generic antihypertensives. You have your ACE inhibitors and your ARBs. And so we felt like he had potentially a better ACE or ARB, but those are generic. They're very cheap. And so if you can be a better antihypertensive, how much better do you need to be? So he decided to go after scleroderma renal crisis because it's an orphan disease. And so there's about 8,000 scleroderma renal crisis patients who are being treated with ACEs or ARBs, but they are they do have some side effects in terms of hyperkalemia and other effects. So we were like, okay, there could be something here. But if you're truly just lowering blood pressure, and that's how you're treating this, you are a symptomatic treatment. You are not a disease modifying therapy. So what pharma wants, what venture wants, is that you are going to fix the underlying cause of the disease. And he hadn't yet shown that he could do it. He did suggest that this angiotensin 1,7, which is a product of the ACE2 enzyme, could have anti-fibrotic effects, but no data had been shown. So ultimately, we ended up giving him a small amount of money and said, go see if this can be an antifibrotic. If it can, it's a disease modifier. You know, we're talking about different things here. If this is truly just a better antihypertensive in a market where everything is generic and only, and I didn't say this, but it's only about 200 patients a year that are progressing to end-stage renal disease of the about 8,000 that have it. So we didn't think there was that much unmet need, but we want to go talk to key opinion leaders to really see if that's the case, because you can read the literature and you can try to come to these conclusions, but sometimes you really just have to talk to the experts to make sure you're understanding it. But ultimately, we're still talking about like 8,000 patients in a market where there's generic pricing. And so you'll see like the commercial opportunity, we were really challenged by some of the preclinical and clinical development were a challenge. Preclinical, there are not good animal models for scleroderma kidney. So it was just a problem. Even if you can treat a mouse, that if the model is bad, it doesn't translate into humans. And venture and pharma want to de-risk their investment as much as possible. And you can de-risk it with good models. So I'm trying not to go on and on too much, but I thought it could be useful to walk you through some of these examples. So questions or comments? Okay. Yeah, I can kind of wrap it up. So these types of analyses are what you would be doing as an entrepreneurial fellow. I mean, if you go into venture, if you go into business development, you'll also be thinking about those types of things. So it's not just applicable, but you know, if you're interested in coming to Chicago, if you're interested in our entrepreneurial fellowship, we have, you know, our applications are opening up. If you will have your PhD in hand by August and this sounds interesting, you know, feel free to reach out. You can apply. You can talk to our fellows. We have Biotech Fizzle Thursdays at 12 p.m. Central Time, we should say. So you could hop on and talk to them. And yeah, that's the end of my presentation.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Liz. That was really insightful. And I love how much in terms of when you shared your sort of decision making, that there's a broader scope above just your professional decisions. There are personal aspects that come into it, whether it's your family obligations or knowing that you want to have a family and be that parent. And then that reality shift of your change in priorities when you do become a parent and what that means professionally and what you need to prioritize there to make that work. So I am happy to send out your slide deck if you have a copy of that, but otherwise I want to go ahead and wrap up and take any additional questions. And if not, we can go ahead and close it out here. Thank you so much.
Yeah, and I'll say, feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn. I'm happy to answer questions, and yeah, best of luck, guys.